The moment that changes a life. There comes a point in a man's life when the past no longer fits him. A moment when he stops being who he once was and steps into who he must become. For Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, that moment arrived on February 12, 1924, at 8:13 in the evening. It did not last a lifetime. It lasted 3 hours and 4 minutes. But when it ended, the man who existed before it was gone forever. Before that night, Bumpy Johnson was not a name people feared. He wasn't respected. He wasn't known. He was just a 19-year-old young man from South Carolina, living quietly in Harlem. He had arrived in New York 3 years earlier, like thousands of others, hoping for something better. He worked whatever jobs he could find. He kept to himself. He read books instead of causing trouble. He stayed away from fights, from crime, from attention. He wasn't connected. He wasn't part of any crew. He wasn't looking for power. He was just trying to survive in a city that made survival feel like a test every single day. No one was watching him. No one expected anything from him. Until his sister came home crying. The event that broke the quiet. That evening, the door opened and Margaret Johnson stepped inside. She was shaking. Her clothes were damaged. Her face showed clear signs of what she had been through. Her voice cracked when she tried to speak. She told her brother what had happened. 3 men had stopped her. They reminded her, cruelly and clearly, what it meant to be a black woman in America in 1924. They treated her dignity as something disposable. They made her feel small. They made her feel powerless. And worst of all, they made her feel afraid. People who knew Bumpy Johnson later said that something changed in him at that exact moment. Not anger. Not rage. Something deeper. Something colder. Like a door inside him closed, and another one opened. A door where fear didn't live anymore. The walk into the night. Bumpy didn't shout. He didn't panic. He didn't cry. He listened. Then he stood up. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't ask for help. He didn't hesitate. He stepped back into the streets of Harlem. What happened next would never be officially recorded. No police report would tell the story. No court would ever hear the details. Because that night nobody saw anything. But word traveled. People said the first man Bumpy confronted tried to explain himself. Tried to soften what had happened. Bumpy answered quietly. Not with shouting. Not with chaos. With certainty. Witnesses later said he sounded almost apologetic. Not for what he was doing, but for what had to be done. The second man realized too late that explanations no longer mattered. By the third man, the one others looked to for confidence, people said Bumpy's eyes looked distant. Not angry. Focused. As if he had stepped into a version of himself that would never step back. The sentence that defined a legend. When it was over, the street fell silent. No cheering. No celebration. Just a young man standing alone under a streetlight. Someone nearby asked him a question. Why? Why risk everything? Why cross a line that could never be uncrossed? Bumpy's voice was low. Barely steady. But his words were clear. They made my sister cry. Nobody makes my family cry. Not police. Not gangs. Not anyone. And if they do, they learn there are consequences. That sentence did not disappear into the night. It became a rule. The vanishing of a boy. The authorities arrived later. They found no evidence. No witnesses. No cooperation. People had suddenly forgotten how to see. Forgotten how to speak. And the quiet young man who had left his home earlier that evening never truly returned. Because that night, Ellsworth Johnson stopped being invisible. And Bumpy Johnson was born. Not as a criminal king. Not yet. But as something Harlem had been waiting for, even if it didn't know it yet. A man who would not accept humiliation as normal. A man who would not let fear write the rules. Harlem in 1924. The world that created him. To understand that night, you must understand Harlem in 1924. Not the Harlem you see in books. Not the one remembered for music, poetry, and art. That version came later, after outsiders decided black culture was something to admire. In 1924, Harlem was crowded, unforgiving, alive with tension. More than 200,000 black residents were packed into aging buildings. Jobs were scarce. Wages were low. Families worked twice as hard for half the pay. They built lives under constant pressure. Every street had invisible boundaries. Every interaction carried risk. There were rules, not written but understood by everyone. Don't cross certain streets. Don't speak too loudly. Don't argue. Don't challenge authority. Don't forget your place. And if someone did forget, there were groups whose job was to remind them. Harlem didn't need heroes yet. It needed protection. The rise of a different kind of power. After that night, Bumpy Johnson changed how he moved. He didn't seek attention. But attention found him. People started talking, quietly at first, about the young man who didn't bow, about the brother who stood up when others stayed silent. He read more. He listened more. He learned. Bumpy understood something early that many never did. Fear can control people, but respect lasts longer. He didn't act without reason. He didn't act without limits. He believed strength meant responsibility. And Harlem noticed. Why this story still matters. Bumpy Johnson's story is often told as a story of crime. But that's not how it began. It began as a story about dignity. About a man who saw his family hurt and decided that silence was no longer an option. About a neighborhood pushed into corners, and the people who pushed back. Whether you see Bumpy Johnson as a protector, a criminal, or something in between depends on where you stand. But one thing is certain. That night in February didn't just change one man. It changed Harlem's future. Because once someone proves that fear is not permanent, everyone else begins to believe it too. Closing, the birth of a legend. History often remembers names, not moments. But legends are born in moments. Quiet ones. Painful ones. Moments when a person decides that enough is enough. For Bumpy Johnson, that moment came at 8:13 p.m. And when it ended, Harlem would never be the same. Tommy Connors and his two partners had been a constant presence on Harlem's western edge for years. They controlled the docks. They ran the backroom bars. They collected money from shop owners who didn't want trouble. All three men were Irish. All three believed that their skin color gave them authority wherever they stood. They moved through Harlem like they owned it, reminding black residents again and again that this might be their neighborhood, but power still belonged to someone else. On the evening of February 12, 1924, they noticed a young woman walking alone. Her name was Margaret Johnson. She was 21 years old, worked long hours as a seamstress in a downtown clothing shop, and earned just enough to help cover rent for the small apartment she shared with her younger brother on West 139th Street. Margaret was careful. She knew the unspoken rules of the city. She didn't look for attention. She didn't argue. She kept her head down and her pace steady. That night, she made a simple choice that should not have mattered. She wore a clean blue dress with white trim. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't flashy. But it fit well, and it showed that she carried pride in herself. And to the wrong men, that pride looked like defiance. The corner that changed everything. It happened near 134th Street and Lenox Avenue, around 7:30 in the evening. The sidewalks were crowded. People were heading home from work. Store owners were locking doors. Music drifted from hidden bars as the night crowd began to gather. Margaret was already thinking about dinner, wondering if her brother had remembered to buy bread like she asked. She never saw them step out of the alley until they were blocking her path. One of them spoke first. "Where are you headed?" She tried to walk around them. That was always the rule. Don't respond. Don't escalate. Just keep moving. But one of the men reached out and grabbed her arm. Another voice followed, mocking. "She asked you something." Margaret pulled free and spoke calmly. "I bought my dress. Please move." The leader laughed. loud enough for people nearby to hear. That laugh drew attention. And attention, in Harlem in 1924, was dangerous. More words followed. Cruel ones. Designed to embarrass. Margaret felt dozens of eyes turn toward her, and then turn away just as quickly. People heard. People saw. And people kept walking. That was survival. Humiliation in plain sight. One of the men pushed her back against the brick wall behind her. Not enough to injure her, just enough to remind her who was in control. The leader stepped closer. "You come up from the south thinking things are different now," he said. "They're not." He grabbed the collar of her dress and pulled. The fabric tore. Not badly, but enough. Enough to humiliate. Enough to strip away dignity in front of strangers. Another man laughed. Margaret felt tears rise, not from fear, but from helpless anger. She knew no one would step in. The police wouldn't come. And if they did, they wouldn't take her side. Then the leader struck her face. The sound carried down the street. "That's for answering back," he said. "Next time, keep moving." The men walked away joking, talking loudly about what might happen if they saw her again. Margaret stayed pressed against the wall, her cheek burning, her dress torn, tears falling as people passed without looking. The walk home. 43 minutes later, she opened the door to the apartment. Her brother, Bumpy, was sitting at the kitchen table with a book open in front of him, something about military history. He read constantly. History. Strategy. Philosophy. He hadn't finished school, but he never stopped learning. When he looked up and saw her, the book slipped from his hands. Margaret had already forced herself to stop crying. She'd wiped her face blocks earlier. Straightened her dress as best she could. She wore the expression she always wore. "I'm fine." But Bumpy saw through it instantly. He stood slowly and stepped closer. His voice was calm. "Who did this?" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter." "Who?" She tried again. "They're dangerous." "I don't care." His tone didn't rise. That frightened her more than shouting ever could. "They touched you," he said quietly. "They made you cry." She whispered, "Please don't." Bumpy's face didn't change. "Nobody does that to my family," he said. "Not ever." "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to make sure they never do it again." He walked out. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, knowing that even if he returned, the brother she grew up with would not. What they didn't know about Bumpy. What those men didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson had learned how to survive long before Harlem. In South Carolina, growing up poor and unwanted, he had learned a simple truth. If you don't protect yourself, no one else will. He hadn't learned to fight in gyms. He learned it in alleys, in schoolyards, in moments where backing down meant never being safe again. He didn't fight for pride. He fought to end threats. And tonight, someone had made his sister feel unsafe. The first confrontation. He found the first man outside a bar on 133rd Street, alone, drunk, laughing to himself. The man didn't even register Bumpy at first. When he did, he smirked. Then Bumpy struck. Quick, direct. The man collapsed against the wall, stunned. "You grabbed my sister," Bumpy said calmly. "You thought it was funny." The man tried to apologize. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. "You're sorry you got hurt," he said. "That's not the same thing." He made sure the message would be remembered, not through cruelty, but through consequence. Then he walked away. The second man. The next man was inside a crowded backroom bar. Bumpy walked in quietly. Conversations faded as people noticed the blood on his knuckles and the certainty in his stride. He stopped at a table. "You were there tonight." The man reached for something. Bumpy reacted first. The room erupted, shouting, scrambling, people backing away. When it was over, the second man lay on the floor, wounded and terrified. "You laughed," Bumpy said. "That made you part of it." No one tried to stop him as he left. Everyone had just witnessed something new. Someone who refused to submit. Tommy Connors. Tommy Connors wasn't hiding. He'd heard what happened. He was waiting. They met again at the same bar. Tommy stood, confident, prepared. "You've got nerve," he said. "But you don't understand who you're dealing with." Bumpy didn't answer. The fight was brutal and fast. Tommy was bigger, more experienced, but Bumpy fought with purpose. Every strike carried meaning. When it ended, Tommy Connors lay broken on the floor. Bumpy pulled him up by the collar. "We're taking a walk. The street where it began." They returned to 134th and Lennox. People watched from windows. Doors cracked open. Bumpy forced Tommy to his knees. "Apologize," he said. "To my sister. To everyone." Tommy tried to speak. Bumpy leaned in. "You can apologize now," he said calmly. "Or you can explain it with broken hands." Tommy understood. He nodded. And in that moment, Harlem understood too. The rules had changed. The choice that sealed his name. "Choose." Tommy's voice barely carried. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry for touching her. I'm sorry for what I said." More than 50 people stood watching as a man who had ruled their streets for years broke down on his knees. This was the same man who had taken money from shop owners. The same man people crossed the street to avoid. The same man who had never apologized to anyone in his life. And now, he was crying in public. Bumpy Johnson stood up and looked around at the faces gathered in the shadows. People at windows. People in doorways. People who had learned, for years, to stay silent. "This is what happens when you disrespect women in Harlem," Bumpy said calmly. "You don't disappear. You live, with everyone knowing exactly who you are." He looked down at Tommy one last time. "Leave Harlem," he said. "Don't come back. If I see you again, there won't be another warning." Then he turned and walked away. Tommy stayed where he was, shaking, long after Bumpy disappeared down the street. And everyone who witnessed that night would tell the story for the rest of their lives. Power is not just about one night. Bumpy understood something most 19-year-olds never do. Power isn't about winning a single confrontation. It's about making sure you never have to fight the same battle again. The very next morning, Bumpy walked into the Savoy Ballroom and asked for a meeting with Stephanie St. Clair, known throughout Harlem as the Queen of Numbers. She already knew his name. Everyone did. A teenager had stood alone against 3 men who had ruled those blocks, and changed the rules overnight. "You're the Johnson boy," she said, studying him carefully. "You caused quite a stir." "Yes, ma'am," Bumpy replied. "And I'm here because I don't want this to happen again." She raised an eyebrow. "You think they'll come back for you?" "They might," he said. "And I want to make sure they understand that doing so would be a mistake." "You want protection?" Bumpy shook his head. "I want work." That caught her attention. "I'm good at finding information. I'm good at organizing people. I solve problems before they grow. You need someone like that. And I need people to know I belong to you now." Stephanie leaned back, silent for a long moment. Most young men wanted to prove how tough they were. This one wanted to be strategic. That made him valuable. "You start Monday," she said. The message spreads. By that afternoon, word had moved through Harlem and beyond. Bumpy Johnson now worked under Stephanie St. Clair. Anyone who crossed him would be answering to her. Tommy Connors heard the news, and understood immediately. He could no longer touch Bumpy without starting a conflict he could never survive. Worse than that, his own people had heard the story. They knew how he had ended that night. In their world, reputation was everything. And his was gone. 3 days later, Tommy Connors left New York. He went north, found work far from Harlem, never spoke publicly about what happened. Not because he lost a fight, but because he lost his standing. And once that's gone, there is no coming back. A legend is born. The story traveled fast. Not just in Harlem, but across New York's underworld. There was a young man, barely out of his teens, who stood up alone because someone hurt his sister. Who forced a man feared for years to answer publicly for what he had done. Who didn't chase power, but understood it. The Hudson Dusters faded away soon after. No one wanted to belong to a group that had been undone by one determined young man. And Bumpy? He spent the next 4 decades becoming something Harlem had never had before. Not just a figure of fear, but a symbol. Someone people believed would stand up when others stayed silent. Someone who made it clear that respect was not something handed out, it was something earned and defended. The night Harlem never forgot. That night never made the newspapers. The reports were buried. The details left unspoken. But Harlem remembered. And for decades afterward, when someone new came into the neighborhood thinking they could push people around, someone would tell them the story. The story of the night a quiet young man chose his family over his own safety. The night a boy stopped being invisible and became a legend. Not because he was the strongest, not because he was reckless, but because when it mattered most, he did not hesitate. OUTRO, YouTube Safe CTA. If this story stayed with you, show your support by liking the video and subscribing for more untold stories from Harlem's history. And let us know in the comments, what would you have done in his place? We share stories like this every week. Stories history didn't write down, but people never forgot.